Hey guys, welcome back. So we are on a Windows 2000 system today, and we are going to install a domain controller on Windows 2000. This is much different than on a 2016 or 2012 or even 2008 R2 server or 2008 forward. So I'm going to walk you through the process of installing DNS, installing a domain controller with group policy, and then configuring DHCP on Windows 2000. Okay guys, so now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to configure DNS. And to do that, the first thing we have to do is we have to set a static IP address on our server. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to go to Settings, and then you're going to go to Control Panel, and then you're going to go to Network and Dial-Up Connections. Then you're going to go to your local area connection, go to Properties, go to TCP/IP connection. Go in there and then set your static IP address to something on your infrastructure statically. Okay, so once you have your static IP address set, the next thing you're going to do is we're going to install DNS and DHCP services. To do that, you click Start, Settings, Control Panel. We're going to go to Add Remove Programs, Add Remove Windows Components, and we're going to scroll down and we're going to find Network Services. Click on Details. And now we're going to only select the ones that we want to select for the services we want to use. So for this case, we want to use DHCP and DNS. So we'll click OK, and we'll click Next. And this will install the DHCP and DNS services on your Windows 2000 system. Once this finishes, reboot your system. Okay guys, so now that the server's back up, what we're going to do first is we're going to make sure that the DNS and the DHCP services are installed, and at least the services are running. So what you'll do is click Start, Programs, Administrative Tools. You'll find DNS and DHCP, and you'll click on each of these things and make sure that you don't have any errors. So DNS looks good. We'll do the same thing and we'll go to DHCP. And we'll see that DHCP looks good as well. Okay, so now that we have DNS and DHCP installed, and up and running, and we've checked that, and also if we haven't already, make sure you have rebooted before we get to this next step. Okay, so now what we want to do is we're going to DC promo the server to promote it to a domain controller. Now in newer versions of Windows, you just go to Server Manager, you add the role for the Active Directory domain services, and that's how you would DC promo. But in older servers, that wasn't an option. So what we'll do is we'll go to Start, we'll go to Run, and we'll type in DC promo. And hit Enter. And we'll see the installation wizard for Active Directory. We'll click Next. Then we're going to do a domain controller for a new domain. You would do an additional domain controller if you wanted to add this to another one that already existed, like an existing domain, but we don't. So we're just going to do new domain controller. And then we have a choice between creating a new domain tree or create a new child domain in an existing domain tree. And since this is a new domain, we're going to choose create a new domain tree and click Next. And then we're going to get an option for create a new forest of the domain tree or place this new domain tree in existing forest. And since this is a new forest with a new domain controller, we're going to choose just the default to create a new one and click Next. Then it's going to ask us for the DNS name. And since we're going to continue on with our YouTube domain demonstrations, I'm just going to use ytd.local. And then I'm going to click on Next. Okay, so now it's going to ask us for the NetBIOS name, which is just a shortened name. This is usually what you would put in whatever it is, / your administrator or / your username account. Generally not, you're going to use the fully qualified domain. So for the sake of this, I'm just going to use the YTD and then click Next. Okay, so after we've clicked Next, now it's going to ask us for the database location and the log location. You could change this location in Windows 2000 and put it somewhere else if you want to put it on like the E drive or whatever else. That doesn't matter until you get to about 2008 when the group policy configurations changed. And then again, it'll take place in 2000
2008 R2 to 2019 server, where you'll end up with the DFS replication changes. So your sysvol location changes and the encryption algorithm changes. So if you change this location now and you're using this as a lab to upgrade to the later version, and you want to go through the full process from a system that had this modified already, you're going to have to go through the process changes in the 2008 R2 environment before you can replicate the data. If not, you'll have group policy failure issues in your Windows 10 and 11 machines. So for the sake of this, because we know we're going to troubleshoot working with Windows 10 and 11 on a 2000 domain controller, I'm going to leave it in the default location, so that way I can mimic the later versions of the operating systems if need be in order to control the later desktop OSs. So we'll click next. Okay, so now we're going to choose the sysvol location. Again, this is the same with the older revision, the older thinking, is that on this configuration, because we want to control the later operating systems, we're going to leave this in the default location and then probably configure a hardened UNC path to get to the default location from a Windows 10 or 11 machine, so we could mimic to see if we could actually control those desktops. Again, you could change this and put this in a different location, but if you're building this lab as a test to migrate, be it from like 2000, 2003, 2008, 2012, 16, 19, and 22, you probably want to leave this in the default location, because if not, in the 2008 R2 environment, you're going to have to make some changes for your replications to work correctly, as well as for the desktops to actually communicate correctly for group policy. So for the sake of this, we're just going to leave it in the default location and click on Next. Okay, so now at this point, you're going to get to the prompt where Configure DNS. Now, if you've previously installed it, like you would have in the previous portion of this video, then you could click the Yes, Install and Configure DNS on this computer recommended, or you could click on the No, I will install and configure DNS myself. That's up to you. Either one will work at this point because we already have it on this system. Okay, so after you've configured your DNS, now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Active Directory installation for the permissions compatible with pre-2000 servers, or the permissions compatible with 2000 servers. Now, if you're running like older machines, if you want to use this as control for like Windows NT machines to screw around with the older stuff, then you're going to leave it for compatibility with pre-Windows 2000 systems. I'm not. I'm going to set it as 2000 and better. And the reason why is because eventually I'd like to control the clients that are, Windows 10 and Windows 11. So again, this is up to you. You could still use the pre-configuration or pre-2000 server configuration to try to control Windows 10 and 11, but you'll have to go through additional steps to do it. In other words, NT4 domain controllers technically will not work with a Windows 2000, Windows X, well, technically they don't work with Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 7, 8, 8.1, 10, and 11. You'll have problems with those. Is there a way around it so it'll still work? Absolutely. Will you get the full functionality? Absolutely not. So for the sake of this, because we're trying to make it so we could use a 2000 DC to control Windows 10 and 11, I'm going to specifically set the permissions to work with Windows 2000 and later configuration, and then click Next. So now we're going to put in the password. This is the directory services restore password. This should be something not the same as your login. Just make it something that write it down somewhere so you have it, so that way you remember it if you need to restore or recover from the system. Again, if this is just a test system, you can make it anything you want. Once you put it in, just click Next. Okay, so now that we have our passwords in, our DNS is configured, our database is set up, our sysvol location is set up, we've created the name of our domain, we've gone through all the steps, we're going to click on Next, and the system's going to configure Active Directory. Once this finishes, the system will either prompt or will reboot, and once it comes back up, just log back into it. Okay guys, so at this point you should have gotten the prompt to finish. You click the finish, and then you would have gotten another prompt to reboot the server, and you'd click yes to reboot the server, and the server would have rebooted. And at that point, you get the prompt to log into the system, and we'd be back at the screen we're at now. So now that we're back in Windows 2000, let's confirm that everything is running. So we'll click on Start, we'll go to Programs, Administrative Tools, and we'll see Active Directory, Domains and Trusts, Sites and Services, and Users and Computers. Let's click on Users and Computers. And this is going to bring up our default Active Directory configuration. So we'll see the domain controller that we just set up here added on the system as the domain controller. And if we right click and go to properties, we could see that it's a Windows 2000 server, which is what we're currently on. So we know that Active Directory users and computers at least is running. So we're going to close this. And we're going to go to the DNS services to make sure that that's working correctly. So once again, programs, administrative tools, DNS. And we'll expand this and go to the forward lookup zone. And there's ytd.local. So that's the domain controller we just set up. It's our IP address, and that's the actual server name. So DNS is working. We don't have a reverse lookup zone. If we want to create one, just right-click, do New Zone, click Next. I would do Standard. You could do Active Directory Integrated. It's up to you, but I would generally just do Standard Primary. Click Next. And then the IP address scope, subnet you're on. So on this one, it's 192.168.242.x. It's a /24. So you would think, because it's reverse, you want to put the 242.168.192 in here, but you don't. You want to keep it still in the correct direction. So you just do 192.168.242. And you'll see here it'll automatically populate the reverse down here, and you'll click Next. And then you'll click Next, and you'll click Finish. And here's your reverse lookup zone. So we'll see the domain controller in here. So now what that means is that every time you do an NS lookup based off of an IP address, it'll translate it to an actual name. So that's why that's usable. You don't necessarily need it, but it's a good practice to get into when you're configuring servers, is to set up the reverse lookup zone. So the next thing we'll do is we'll check the DHCP services, which we know is installed, but we don't have currently configured. So let's get that configured. So once again, it's just Start, Programs, Administrative Tools, and then click on DHCP. Okay, guys, so now that we have DHCP open, I've expanded the DHCP folder a little bit, just in hopes that it'd be easier for you to see. I realize that making it full screen and having it up in the corner up here may not be the best thing to do for this setup. So what we're going to do is just in the DHCP tree, you'll see your server name, you see the IP address that your server has. You're just going to right click on it and choose New Scope. Then you're going to click Next. You're going to name the scope something, so we're just going to call it like 2K YTD. And we'll hit Next. Now we're going to have to set up our IP address subnet for our DHCP services. Now keep in mind, you don't want to use the full subnet. You only want to use a block of addresses. The reason why is because you want some addresses that you could set for static IP address, things like your servers. Obviously, in the later versions of Windows, what you would use is you'd use a DHCP reservation for a lot of your later systems. But in 2000, the 2000 practice was really just to use static IP addresses on your servers and not use dynamic DHCP reservations. That whole fad didn't really take place until about 2012 R2, just because the DHCP services got a little more reliable. Not saying that they're not reliable in 2000, they are, but it's just the practice changed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do 192.168.242.50. And then we're going to do 192.168.242.199. And we're going to do a /24. And what that means is that we have really 252 usable addresses. Now, if we wanted to do a /16 and make this like 0.0 and make this like 192.168.0.50 or 0.50 to 254.199, we could do that. If you wanted to do the full entire octet of /16, I think it's 65,536 addresses I think are usable. So there'd be an enormous amount of addresses usable for your DHCP scope. Keep in mind, if you do that, you're in a big enterprise, and at that point you really shouldn't, you should do load balancing. So you should have more than one DHCP server set up for load balancing, so that way it's not all the addresses hitting their primary domain controller all the time. Or put DHCP on its own system and not tie it to Active Directory like it is here. So we're just going to, for the sake of this, going to use /24 with the 255.255.255.0, and we'll click Next. And then we're going to add exclusions. So this is where you would add exclusions in your actual subnet. So your 50 to 199. If you know that you have an address in there somewhere that you want to exclude from the DHCP scope, you could do it. I've never really seen the purpose of doing this here, because If you already know that you have an address at 10, 11, and 12, then why wouldn't you just start the subnet at 13 and then go to like 199, say 200 is something like a printer? I don't understand why you would do that here. I could see it later because, things change on your infrastructure. Having to add these things later makes sense, but doing it here has never really made sense to me. So for the sake of this, because we don't need to, we're going to click next. And this is the amount of time that you want to allow the addresses to have to be linked to a specific system or device. Now, keep in mind that if you are in, say, like a environment where, I don't know, maybe do like oil changes, like a quick lube, and you're going to have a lot of people on your Wi-Fi constantly, in and out, in and out, in and out, you probably want to make this like 40 minutes, 20 minutes. You don't want to make it 8 days, because then an address will be tied to a piece of equipment for 8 days, and that device will likely never be back in your infrastructure. So you got to plan this appropriately for the type of environment that you're actually running. For the sake of this, we're just going to do 0 days, and we'll do 1 hour. We're going to click on next, and then it's going to ask us if we want to configure the DHCP options for the scope now. Now, you could do it now or later. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to choose yes and then click next. Okay, so options. So in the new scope options configuration wizard, what we're going to get here is we're going to have to enter in our default gateway, which is just simply 192.168.242.1. Once you add whatever your default gateway is in here, you'll hit add, and that's what you use. So obviously, if you have 192.168.1.1, you'd put that in there. Whatever yours is on your current configuration for your test system that we have built here. Then you're going to click on next. Under here, we're going to get the domain name and DNS server configuration. All this is this is the name of your current internal domain. So whatever you created, for the sake of this, I used ytd.local, which is what my parent domain is. You'll have to enter your server name. If you don't know how to do that, just open up command prompt, type in host name, and you'll get your system's server name. You'll enter that in, and then you'll hit resolve, and you'll see the IP address of your server, assuming your DNS is configured correctly. So then you just click add, and you click next. So in here now is Wins. Since we're going to use modern hardware, we're going to configure Windows 10 and Windows 11 for the sake of this test to see if we can control it. We do not need Wins. If you're running Windows 2000, technically you don't need Wins. But if you checked the other configuration prior, because you're going to do NT4, NT3.5 configurations, you're going to need to configure yourself a Win server. So what I would do is tell you to just check the description. I'll put a link down there on how to configure Wins. So if you don't need Wins, you're going to run later Windows 2000, XP, so on and so forth, you could just click next. Then it's going to ask you if you want to activate the scope. I'm going to choose no. I will activate the scope later. If you want to turn the scope on right now, you could by just clicking yes and then hitting next. And then once you get to this point, you just hit finish. And then under here, we're going to see our configuration. So we're going to see our address pool. So this is the 242.50 through the 242.199, the address range that we created. We're going to see the leases. This is where you would see clients start to connect once you have the DHCP enabled. Reservations would be the IP address reservations you would create. And again, this is way more popular in the later operating systems than it is in Windows 2000. And then the scope options, which is what we just created. So we have the DNS server, we have our default gateway or router, and then we have the DNS name that's associated with our DNS server. Now, if we go down here into server options, you could create the scope options in server options. So that way, every time you created a new scope, you wouldn't have to do the scope options for every single one. You could use a default location, default configuration. Not necessary for this because it's a test, but that's where you would do that. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to go to properties first, and we're going to take a look. We're going to add the description here and just call it Y2K, and then we'll do DHCP. We'll hit apply. Then we're going to go to DNS real quick. We're going to check to see how our DNS configuration is configured for automatic update of DHCP, discard forward name address when lease expires, and we're going to check here. We're going to see the enable for DNS clients that do not support dynamic updates. We don't want to do that because, again, we're going to be running later operating systems. Then we're going to click on advanced. We're going to make sure that we have assigned IP addresses to DHCP only, boot P, or both. for the sake of this, we're just going to do DHCP only. If you're running like VoIP and other stuff like that, then you probably want to check both. So we're just going to click OK because that's all we needed for that. We're going to go up one here, and we're going to go to Properties here under the actual DHCP server itself. We're going to check that, make sure that everything's still set the same. Okay. Under Advanced, under the actual DHCP server itself, you're going to see something called conflict detection attempts. Generally speaking, for every infrastructure, it should be at least 5 milliseconds. And the only reason why is because that gives the system enough time to check your infrastructure to see if you have duplicate addresses or duplicate host names on the infrastructure before it starts handing out IP addresses. Because you don't want to have duplication on your infrastructure. It'll cause all sorts of problems for you. So once you do that, just click Apply, click OK. And then at that point, you would have to right-click on the actual DHCP server and hit Authorize, and then click on the actual scope and hit Activate, and that will activate your DHCP. Again, for the sake of this, because it's not necessary, this is the only server, I'm not going to do that. I'll run static IP addresses on my test machines. But this concludes how to do the DHCP setup. All right, guys, so that concludes our configuration of our domain controller. Setting up DNS, setting up a DHCP, and how to do it on Windows 2000 and what steps and configuration settings you need to at least stage in order to get a Windows 10 and 11 system to work on a Windows 2000 infrastructure. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will continue to make these videos. You guys take it easy now.